Welcome to the first Oxford TSA Tutor video. Today we're going to go through questions 1 to 5 of the TSA Specimen paper. So what you'll need to do, if you haven't already, is find this paper and go through the questions yourself, 1 to 5, and then come back here when you've got your answers, or you can go along with me as we do this and just pause every time I move to a new question. So if you haven't read this question already, take a minute now and figure out what you think the answer is. So the answer to question 1, this motorist question, the answer is D. Now the key with these sorts of questions in the TSA is to always read this last line, because it changes every time. They might ask you what the underlying principle is, what an underlying assumption is, what the fatal flaw of the argument is. So if you read this line first, that's going to save you going through this again to figure out what you were meant to be looking for the first time. So always go to this line first, then read the paragraph, read this line again, and then decide which of these you think matches up. So, as I've said, the answer to question 1 is D, but let's go through each of the other answers as well and see why they were incorrect. So, 1A, this is wrong because it says nothing about how much the individual needs the service. If you look at the original paragraph, it's talking about how much they use the service, and this should correspond to how much they pay. In B, this is wrong because this is actually almost the opposite of the argument in the paragraph above. It says that if you use the service more, then you'll need to pay less. So they've gotten it the wrong way around. C, this is wrong because it says how much you should pay should be in terms of how much you earn, not how much you actually use the service. And if we look up here, it says nothing about how much a person earns, only about how much they use the roads. Let's go on to D. So this one is correct. Only the people who use the service pay for it. So don't get worried by not quite understanding the terminology around television channels and subscriptions. They wouldn't tell you something that was false, so they wouldn't tell you that subscriptions operate in a certain way when in fact they don't, because this is all about logic and logicking out what the right answer is. So they wouldn't put a sort of false premise in one of these, so don't worry about that. And the last one, E, this is wrong because it justifies higher charges on the basis of their motivations for using the service. There's nothing about motivations in here, just about how much they actually use the road. So on to question 2. Again, take a minute to pause. If you haven't filled this out yet. Question 2, the answer is B. This one I thought was pretty simple. The key is, I think the main place where you might make a mistake is if you miss off this, because they've been sort of misleading with this chart and put part-time and full-time employees up at the top, but you also, in your calculations, need to include this number of the self-employed, because as it states in this part of the question, person is employed if they're in full-time or part-time employment, or if they are self-employed. So when you get a chart or some kind of graphic like this, it's important not just to read the chart, but read any little small print at the bottom. It didn't happen to be relevant in this case, but it might be in other cases, and any other information that's outside the box. It's really important. So we end up with the answer B. And for maths, it's always best if you have time and you think you're not running out of time, you should try and figure the answer out first without looking at these multiple choice questions. Because if you get 14.8 when you've worked it out by yourself, then you should be pretty confident that that's right. Whereas if you're figuring it out yourself and you get a number that's not here, you know you've done something wrong. You're going to go back, you're going to read through the whole of the question, and you're going to figure out that you missed out this self-employed bit, and you're going to end up with your 14.8. Question 3. So the key in this kind of question, as we know with this, we go straight to this last line, the best statement of the flaw in this argument. The key is to try and see the flaw yourself straight away before you get into these 5 statements, which are going to try and mislead you as to what the flaw is. See if you can spot it yourself or get a sort of vague idea of what the flaw might be about. So we should see the flaw kind of straight away in this paragraph. It says the number of car fires could be considerably reduced, but there still needs to be a fire before it can be put out. So if you have a motorist that has a fire extinguisher in his car, the car sets on fire, he gets out, gets the fire extinguisher and puts the fire out. The presence of the fire extinguisher made no difference as to whether there was a car fire. It might have put it out quickly, but there was still a car fire. So the presence of a fire extinguisher will not stop or reduce the number of car fires. So let's go through and see which of these answers best sort of captures this flaw that we've already identified before we've even looked at these multiple choice options. So A, this isn't relevant. The argument is that the number of car fires should be reduced below the 25,000 that there currently are per year in Britain. The argument has nothing to do with these other millions of motorists. That's a straw man. Answer 3B. No, this is wrong. It's getting a little closer to our idea, but it doesn't capture the same flaw that we identified in that original paragraph. So this might be a flaw if we look very closely. Maybe motorists wouldn't be able to reach the extinguisher to put the fire out, but B is incorrect because this flaw is irrelevant when we go to the next statement, which is the correct answer, and this shows the bigger flaw. So statement C, this is correct. This is another way of wording our problem that we described at the start. It implies that the occurrence of car fires is related to the lack of an extinguisher, which clearly isn't the case. This is a flaw because the question seems to be assuming that the mere presence of an extinguisher would mean that a fire wouldn't start in the first place. So even if the motorist could put the fire out with the extinguisher, there still would have been a car fire, so it seems that the occurrence of car fires can't be related to the lack of an extinguisher. I hope that makes sense. On to D. Again, this is wrong. It's a similar sort of idea as B. And again, it's irrelevant when we look at the bigger flaw, which is captured by C. And lastly, E. So something to note about this question is that there might be other statements besides the correct one, C in this case, which show some other flaw in the argument, so like we found in B and D. But B and D aren't correct because they're overshadowed by this larger flaw, C, which totally dismantles the argument. So you need to be careful on these find the flaw arguments because you might read E and think, well, that's true. Different types of fires do need different types of extinguishers, so maybe carrying a fire extinguisher wouldn't reduce the number of fires if they're carrying the wrong type. But then we see C, which states this overarching flaw that the presence of any type of fire extinguisher will have no effect on the initial outbreak of the fire. So we know that C, more than any of other of these answers, is the best statement of the flaw in the argument above. Okay, let's move on now to 4. So if you haven't done this, have a quick look at it now. So for question 4, I found this one quite complicated. So I broke it down into parts, beginning with the conclusion, which they've helpfully marked for us by the start of the sentence, one can reasonably conclude. So the conclusion of the argument is teachers are doing a better job at coaching their pupils than they did in previous years, and this is what explains the trend of improving pass rates. And there are two premises. First, pass rates are on an improving trend, so they've been gradually improving over time, or not necessarily gradually, but improving on each year. And the second premise is that there is no other evidence of improvements in students' abilities. Now, this is phrased in a slightly odd way, so it could mean two things. Either that there is no evidence available, so that employers or universities don't publish these statistics. But I think instead it actually means that none of the other data, like the data that is published by employers and university, none of this shows an improvement in school leavers' abilities, which would match the observed trend we have in their exam results. And hence, that's why we get our conclusion. Because if their ability isn't improving, which it seems like it isn't from this evidence from employers and universities, then their teachers must just be doing a better job at coaching them specifically for the exams, not in actually improving their students' overall ability. So let's go through. The correct answer is B, but let's go through all of them and see why the others are incorrect and why B is correct. So for A, this is wrong because the argument is actually saying the opposite of what this statement says. It's saying that school exams are not a reliable indicator of ability, and that's why the writer believes that the tutors must be coaching their pupils in a better way, not actually improving their ability. B is correct because if the level of exam difficulty has been falling, then ability and the quality of coaching which teachers give may have stayed the same while exam results improved. On to 4C, this is irrelevant. There's no mention of employers' expectations anywhere in the paragraph. Employers are mentioned as a source of evidence which show no improvement in school leavers' abilities, but what their expectations were are irrelevant to these measures, and so it's not going to be an underlying assumption. D, a good way, if you're a bit stuck on these types of assumptions questions, is to take out this assumption and see if the argument still makes sense, and from these premises that we can still get to the same conclusion and it logically makes sense. So for D, let's say that teachers in previous years did attempt to coach pupils for exams. These attempts might just have been poor ones. Maybe over time the teachers have gotten better at coaching. So if we remove this underlying assumption by explicitly putting a negative version of it into the argument still makes sense with this premise in, and therefore this is not an underlying assumption. So E, this is irrelevant to the question, but if we use the same tactic as above, we can see that more clearly. So does the argument still hold if we assume that the abilities of school pupils stayed the same from year to year? So i.e. we are explicitly assuming that they did not vary from year to year. And the answer is yes, their ability would stay the same, but we see an improvement in exam pass rates because teachers have gotten better at coaching their pupils. So again, if we put in an explicitly negative version of this assumption, our argument still makes sense, and so we need to reject E, and having rejected all those others, that leaves us with B. Now on to the last question for this video. It's number 5, so take a second to do this if you haven't already. Okay, the argument is C, and again we need to see what they're asking us for before we read through the rest of the paragraph, and they're asking for an underlying assumption of this argument. So 5A, this is wrong because the paragraph says that they report a severe decline especially during the night shift, but they don't say anything about exclusively during the night shift. So a shift worker who doesn't work at night might still have experienced a decline in appetite. Moving on to B, this is irrelevant to the question. Employees might dislike working shifts, but if we drop this assumption and assume they like working shifts, so employing that same tactic we did in the last question of putting in an explicitly negative version of this proposed underlying assumption as an extra premise into the argument. So assume that employees like working shifts, the argument still works, their appetite would still decline. It doesn't make a difference whether they like the shifts or not. The fact is their appetite declines. So even though it seems like a very likely fact that employees dislike working shifts, it's not an assumption that is necessary for the argument to make sense and for us to get from the premises we've been given to the conclusion that we've been given. So moving on to C. Now, this is the correct underlying assumption of the argument. The premise was, as stated in the paragraph, that people working in a 3-shift system report a severe decline in appetite. And the conclusion was that they can expect to lose weight. So we can see that this assumption provides that extra premise, which is the link between the decline in appetite on the one hand in our premise and the decline in weight, which was our conclusion. So again, we can test this by imagining that the assumption doesn't hold. So we imagine the explicit negative version of this assumption. That is that people who feel less hungry or have a lower appetite, to phrase it like it is in the question, generally eat more food. And then we'd expect them to put on weight rather than to lose weight, as the conclusion says they do. So that's another way of just confirming to ourselves that this is the underlying assumption that we need, because without it, our conclusion doesn't make sense. On to D. Again, as with B, this is irrelevant. We don't care why these workers chose to work shifts. The fact is that they do. An underlying assumption is basically a missing premise. So we've been told in our first premise of this paragraph that, quote, some employers operate a 3-shift system. So that's the very first premise of our argument. We don't then need to add an underlying assumption to act as a preceding premise to explain why this first premise is the case. And that's effectively what this assumption is doing. So they have told us that employers operate a 3-shift system. We just accept that. There is no need to explain it. So if we go back to C, we can see that the point of the underlying assumption here was to act as a premise which links one premise to the conclusion, not justifies some premise within the argument. And then lastly, on to E. This is wrong because the writer talks about shift patterns of working causing a decline in appetite. If we reverse this underlying assumption, so again we put in the explicitly negative version of it, assuming that, so we add this premise that canteen facilities are always available to the night shift, the argument still works because the paragraph has told us that they have a decreased appetite, so they wouldn't be eating as much from the canteen anyway, even if it is open. So that brings us to the end of this first instalment. So next week we'll be looking at questions 6 to 10 on this paper, and we'll gradually work our way through the rest of the specimen paper and hopefully on some more. I'll be checking the comments, so let me know if you had any questions about this or if there are any questions on other papers that you'd urgently like me to cover, and I'll see what I can do.